Hi guys, my name's Seb Tudor. I'm the man on the Silver Mountain, and welcome back. Now today I wanted to go through this poll from YouGov that was sponsored by The Economist, um, and this is the final page, the little information page at the end. It was released, or rather, it was done between the 10th and 13th of March this year. It was only done on 1,500 US adults, but so it's not necessarily incredibly representative, but they seem to have randomly sampled by age, gender, everything else to one extent or another from the current population survey registration and voting supplement. Um, in which case, then they did some basic stuff, straightforward stuff, and it was all web based interviews. And it says 25 questions not reported, so I'm guessing that either those were questions that were um, part of the weighting or part of whatever else, or possibly just questions in regards to more private information as well, in regards to names and email addresses and whatever else, if they wanted those from respondents in case they needed to follow up. So, we've got 1,500 US adults, so not super representative of a country that's 324 million people. But they've found some interesting things, depending on how this is all overall been mapped out. So we've got all kinds of stuff on here, and I wanted to take a look at this because there have been people pulling all kinds of things out of nowhere and drawing conclusions that I can't find in here so much. But also, there are some interesting trends that I wanted to take a look at as well. Like most of this stuff about whether or not certain countries are friends and enemies, and Trump's responses, Kim Jong Un's leadership, and stuff like that. Don't really want to go into. I'm interested in the direction of the country. That's kind of broad overview that we'll take a look at. But then we've got all of this other stuff. But then it's where we get down to the moral acceptability stuff that I'm actually kind of interested in, as well as some of the stuff around issues of importance. There are some other bits and pieces here as well, but I don't really care to get into those straight off. But and I can go through more of these if you'd be interested in other videos. But I'm kind of interested more in the direction of the country and then the moral acceptability stuff, more so than anything, purely because those are the things that people have been commenting on most. The US is an incredibly powerful and important country. There are lots of people that have been watching it very closely since Trump got elected, because it's so far outside the norm, and because he is nuts. So, let's take a look at this. But direction of the country is kind of an interesting one, because we've got these three kind of areas that people can look at going, okay, so generally headed in the right direction, off on the wrong track, or not sure. And not sure seems to kind of balance out the same, across male and female, give or take, a couple of points in it. But then there's a really interesting kind of split between men and women, where most women feel the country is completely off track, or at least in the survey. Again, only 1,500 people surveyed. So most women in their survey sample feel that it's off track, but it's much more even between men and between men that think it's going fine and men that think it's don't. That it's not. Again, though, then we look at the age breakdown here, and you've got the rather unsurprisingly, the split gets less and less in regards to the number of people that think their country is on the wrong track. By the time you kind of get into the 65 and above bracket, rather unsurprisingly, you've got an almost, well, relative to everything else, you've got an almost half and half split. Again, unsurprisingly, you've got the black demographic feeling that it's most off track, which again, in part, I would probably imagine is also informed by the amount of news that that they see and the amount of noise that is made by certain groups like Black Lives Matter around the topic, when statistically speaking, like the differences between, say, a poor white person and a poor black person aren't hugely different. But then again, rather unsurprisingly, we're seeing that only the Republicans think that the country's going in the right direction, even though they probably are only saying that because they won the last time rather than anything else. And even then, the split isn't as severe as it could be. Rather unsurprisingly, the kind of, again, we see the people who are on the richer side of things feeling that the country is going better than those who are poorer, who are suffering more. And then in terms of who voted for what, rather unsurprisingly, the lines are still kind of cut the way that we would expect. And then same goes for, like, it's almost a straight up reflection between Democrats, independents, and Republicans, and then the ideologies that they follow. Nothing super surprising there, but stuff that's kind of interesting. But now let's get into the really interesting stuff, which is the moral acceptability of things. And this is the first page, isn't it? Yeah. And this is where we're looking at social stuff that's kind of apolitical. It's become political, but it's not kind of to the extent that you would think of some of the other questions on here. Like a lot of the moral acceptability stuff on here is, basically your opinion on other people's lives, which is kind of interesting to me because of the splits that we start to see. So in regards to birth control, most people think it's morally acceptable, although it's maybe unsurprising, depending on where they pulled some of these people from, that men find it less morally acceptable than women by a very, very small amount. I say it's a small amount, but again, we don't know what the breakdowns are. The thing that kind of made me raise my eyebrows, though, was that in the age categories here, you've got people who are older, people who are 30 up to the 65 plus bracket, all feeling that birth control is more morally acceptable, whilst the 18 to 29, they feel that it's not, the majority still feel it's morally acceptable, but you've still got a much larger difference overall between the two. Where it's you've got only 77% of respondents saying that it is acceptable compared to the 23 that say that it isn't. That's a trend that I wouldn't have expected, and it's interesting. Again, looking across, you've got the white demographic actually feeling that it's completely acceptable, relatively speaking, with the 87% feeling that it's morally acceptable overall. And it's kind of interesting to see how the other populations here don't feel as much, and I'd be interested to see why that is. Is it because those overall tend to see more religious backgrounds in them? Okay, my phone's making weird noises at me. Strange. But I'd be interested to see some follow-up on that, just to see why say only 3/4 of the black respondents felt that it was morally acceptable, that birth control was morally acceptable. How is it that 1/4 of those individuals that responded felt that it isn't morally acceptable, when for the most part you've got, give or take, around 90% of the white individuals there saying that it's acceptable, and about 80% of the Hispanic and so on. It's interesting. And the other one, there's not enough information there to break down more on that. Then we've got, again, something we wouldn't necessarily find unexpected in Republicans finding that it is least acceptable of the three party demographics. But then the next thing that really interested me was that with the family income, the lower incomes find that it's less morally acceptable to use birth control, which again is kind of counterintuitive. You would think, well, they're not going to be able to afford to have kids. They should, but everyone should still be allowed to have sex as long as you've got access to means by which to prevent unwanted pregnancies. And so you would have thought that they would be more in favour of it, but they're not. And whether that has some correlation between the various other bits and pieces that we're looking at here, who knows? But then, again, rather unsurprisingly, we see that Hillary Clinton's camp, the far more liberal-focused, arguably, group are more in favour of birth control compared to Trump's, although that's still not a huge difference. They're still both majority in favour of birth control being acceptable. And then again, rather unsurprisingly, you're seeing a drop-off of conservatives finding it acceptable, but still not to a huge amount. So apparently birth control, everyone's on board with. So now moral acceptance of a divorce. And so here you're finding men finding it less acceptable, probably for various reasons that are more legal as well, rather than anything else. Whilst women are finding it more acceptable, you're finding it more and more acceptable to people who are both very young or people who are getting older, but then you've got that middle ground of the 30 to 44 bracket who have found it less acceptable, but still not, the worst. Moving on to the racial demographics that they've got here, and you've got, whites and Hispanic individuals and the other category all finding it about the same as acceptable as anything else, whilst the black demographic are actually finding it less acceptable. Again, could that be because there is a very large kind of black component to the religions that are practiced in the United States? Who knows? I'd like to see numbers on that. That would be much more interesting. Moral acceptability of it from party perspectives, Republicans finding it almost a 50-50 split between acceptable and unacceptable, or acceptable and wrong. And the thing that stands out to me, though, there is, but there you've got your current president and a group of other people who are, who have been demonstrated to have affairs, doing all these things and so on and so forth, and yet they're not kind of brushing those people away. And again, those that support Donald Trump, who has divorced, who has had, is it 2? I know that I think it's 3 wives, isn't it, for Trump? I don't know. It's either 2 or 3. But he's and yet the people who are supporting him are finding it far more wrong than those who supported his counterpart. And then again, you're seeing the same kind of split as we saw with the parties, where conservatives are almost a 50-50 split between what they find, between finding it acceptable and finding it unacceptable. Death penalty, and now this is one in the States that is a tough one, because it's a thing there that's so institutional, everyone's behind it to one extent or another because of the culture of the place, and it's not, there's nothing else to it. And so, the only demographic that's seeing it as kind of negative is still nearly a 50-50 split. Same with the only racial demographic, which is the black demographic, which is still also only seeing it at about a 50-50 split. Rather unsurprisingly, though, you have... Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Rather unsurprisingly, though, you have the largest in favour group being Republicans and conservatives, who are like 3/4 in favour of. And then everyone else seems to be kind of balanced out. The only big one is again, a kind of no-brainer. The people that supported Donald Trump were far more inclined towards it, considering that they're conservative, Republican, looking at it there. Right. Premarital sex. Now, this is one that interests me a little bit because of what we were talking about in regards to birth control earlier. So where we had birth control, here it is, where we've got most people feeling it's completely fine and all the rest of it, and you've got the black demographic being the largest here, of the various racial demographics saying maybe we don't want that so much, but they still, the vast majority still do. Here you've got, an even split between men and women thinking it's acceptable. You've got a fair balance, but obviously a drop off as you get older. So the older people think it's less acceptable. Bit of a no-brainer. But then here we get, everyone thinks it's acceptable, apart from the black community, who are 50-50 split on it again, with a very, very slight leaning towards it being unacceptable. Which, again, is that religious? Is that, what is the reason behind that? If that's the case, then, you still look at kind of teen births and things like that, and you do still have a large issue with that in certain parts of America, in black communities especially. So, how does that all add up? There's a couple of dissonances and interesting things here, like the Trump supporters feeling that divorce and things like that are the worst, or worse than anyone else, and yet then still supporting people who have had potentially multiple divorces and stuff like that. So there's an interesting dissonance there, but also here we've got an interesting kind of dissonance between where it's not even a dissonance, it's a lack of decisiveness between them going, yeah, birth control maybe not as acceptable as it could be, premarital sex, no, it sucks, but then you move on to take a look at the other figures around those demographics within this country, and it's really weird and it's interesting. But then again, premarital sex drops off when you're talking about Republican views on it, especially conservative Republican views on it, and people that supported Trump are almost a 50-50 split again as well. So you've got these kind of weird shifts here and there around this. Gay and lesbian relationships, men apparently from their respondents kind of overall finding them acceptable, but it's more of a 50-50 split. Women being more open to it, but then again, potentially that's also informed by other stuff. Rather unsurprisingly, the younger people are more accepting than the older people by a long way on this. The various demographics are all accepting, but again, we've got a couple here that are more 50-50 than not. But then again, looking at which demographics are larger in the US, you've got a very large white demographic, which is going to water down the numbers, and then the black demographic may be more diverse overall than the Hispanic or other. So we don't have enough information to draw exactly why that is here, but it's interesting to take note of the figures. I went past it. Rather unsurprisingly, we've got the Republicans, who are much less in favour, and same with those with conservative views and those who follow Donald Trump. These three seem to add up for everything, if in terms of party identification, ideology, and who they voted for in 2016. Almost all of them seem to add up solidly, although again that does cause some really weird disconnects between apparently what they believe and some of the stuff we'll take a look at in a minute. Doctor-assisted suicide, euthanasia, most people, again, but it's almost a 50-50 split across the board here, but the ones that stand out as saying that it's not right at all by a very large margin, because you've got a 10% split between the two Hispanic groups, both accepting and unaccepting, but you've got nearly 30% or so kind of split between these two, and and that's what is it that's prompting that again? There's an awful lot of stuff here that's in the numbers that it's just like, well, I want to be able to read into this. There's not enough follow-up, because what is it that makes, is it religion? Because if so, fair enough. But is it religion that prompts those views? Is it something else? It'd be interesting to have that follow up. Again, rather unsurprisingly, Republicans and conservatives and those that support Trump all line up again with them feeling that it's less acceptable or whatever else. But that's interesting, considering that they're also the people that don't want healthcare for everybody, and they are quite and so potentially doctor assisted suicide is just a doctor turning people away. But that's just my thought. Now, abortion. Now this is an interesting one to me, because everybody feels that it's morally wrong, even if it's only by a small amount. Everybody does, with black individuals seemingly feeling that it's morally wrong the most, but everyone does, even if it's a fairly 50-50 split almost, not 100%, men being more 50-50 than women women being more 50-50 than men, overall, which again is odd to me. But then you've got those who are democratic and liberal being more focused towards whatever. You've got more of a 50-50 over moderates and independents, and then Republicans, of course, especially conservatives, are really against it. But then, that lines up again with who they voted for. And that one seems really weird to me, because it's just that's a personal, private choice. And whilst I feel that there could be more stipulations, more protections in terms of the legal side of things, whether or not someone keeps or loses a child, as it were. For instance, if you had a woman that wanted to keep a child and a man who didn't, having what's been dubbed a legal abortion on the part of the man to completely remove himself from that situation, saying that it was her decision to have the child and all that kind of thing, and that he therefore, as much as he was responsible for the initial act, bears no responsibility moving forward, because she's made this decision on her own. It prevents kind of the some of the stories that we see of people becoming trapped because of those kind of situations where someone has inadvertently or potentially kind of under suspicious circumstances gotten pregnant just to trap someone else. So it's interesting, but it's more interesting to me just that everybody seems to, across just the basic demographics here of age and gender and race, that they all seem to think it's not good. It's strange to me. But then you turn around to gambling, something that actually does harm, and everyone's fine with it. It's shocking. And it's one of the things that's really surprising to me is that the people who supported Hillary Clinton and liberals are more in favour of it. Not the parties. The party IDs are all kind of balanced out. But liberals and moderates are more in favour than conservatives, and Hillary Clinton supporters were more in favour of gambling than Donald Trump supporters. That just doesn't seem to work out in my head. The big billionaire who enjoys his luxury and whatever else, who has dabbled in the ownership of casinos, from what I understand. His supporters were less in favour of it than his opposition. Killing animals for their furs, pretty much everybody agrees that this isn't a good thing either, which again, completely fine, completely makes sense. With the Trump Republican Conservative kind of split here, all agreeing on that, maybe to a slightly lesser extent than otherwise, but agreeing overall. Hunting animals for sport, again, most people agreeing that this isn't something that's good, with the smallest splits being, rather unsurprisingly, again, between Republicans and conservatives, but oddly enough, the Donald Trump supporters was still 50-50. So, interesting stuff. Interracial marriage, apparently everyone's in favour of it. which is fine. Republicans, conservatives, being the only ones that stand out as being below 80%. Even Trump supporters are above the 80%. So it's kind of telling. Maybe some of the people that they've got were in their kind of realm. Cloning humans, everyone believes it's bad, which I can understand this one more than any of the others. But with obviously Republicans and kind of old people and conservatives and Trump supporters all lining up on this and being about 90% in favour of it being a bad thing, whilst there's a bit more wiggle room the younger you get. Men and women having an affair, everybody again agreeing that it's wrong. Women agreeing that it's wrong far more than men, though, which is interesting. But everyone and people, the older you get, agreeing that it's more wrong overall. So that's interesting. And the same though, you've got Republicans and Donald Trump supporters and conservatives feeling more strongly than anyone else that it is the most wrong. Although then look at some of the accusations around the candidate and the evidence that's piling up against the individual that they supported. Little bit of a disconnect there. Smoking marijuana, most people find it acceptable unless you're over 65 apparently, or 65 and above. There's a fairly even agreement overall. The only people again that are disagreeing are Republicans, conservatives, Trump supporters, and the people of 65 and above. Kind of seems to suggest some overlap here maybe. Drinking alcohol, everyone's in favour of it, everyone's fine. The people that stand out as most against are Republicans, conservatives again. But again, that sounds really... that there's a little bit of a disconnect there in my head, considering that an awful lot of the people who are wealthy in their country have their hands in things like cigarettes, alcohol, oil, those large industries that everybody needs to one extent or another, either feeding addictions or as part of diets or as energy sources. It's interesting to see how they're the most against it, but they're also the most in favour of the people that put it into their economy for purchase and use. So, there's that. But then, here we go. This is the interesting one. So you've got people going, okay, so what bothers you more? Which is elected officials not working in the country's to improve the country's moral values, or being hypocritical and working, not adhering to their own spouting of moral standards. So, for instance, people saying, "Oh, I wouldn't do this," or "I would do that," and then going and doing it anyway. And for the most part, people are, elected officials being hypocritical. They are more bothered by it, almost across the board to various extents. Whoops. And it's interesting because Republicans are the least bothered by it, but then you get down to like the conservatives here, and they are still mostly bothered by it. So are the conservatives, and then you go, okay, well, is it acceptable to vote for a candidate that's immoral? And most people in the Clinton camp, in the Democratic camp, the liberal camp, all going, no, it's not acceptable to vote for an immoral candidate. We need to vote with the patterns of behaviour. And remember, we saw up here that, again, these guys are bothered by people being hypocritical. And yet then they go, yeah, but it's absolutely fine to vote for an immoral candidate. Absolutely fine. Relative to the split overall, they're going, yeah, we can mostly agree that it's fine to do so. Which is a weird disconnect. But then we've got this respondent hypocrisy question. Do you consider yourself to be a hypocrite if you vote for a presidential candidate who has done immoral acts in his or her life? And then you've got interesting splits up here where, you know, male individuals are going no, and female individuals are going no more so than anything else. But the interesting thing is, how are they taking this? Because if they're going, well, if I voted for them and then they did something bad, then fine. You know, I wasn't to blame for that. But in regards to the situation with Trump, for instance, where he had evidence piling up against him before he was even elected, and they've gone, no, I'm not a hypocrite for ignoring those other things and acknowledging that he's immoral, and then just voting for him anyway. I'm not a hypocrite, even though that's exactly what I've said in my other responses up here. Like, again, it highlights, this is the thing that I kind of wanted to highlight, because you've got all of these different moral questions and you've got various forms of agreement here that are interesting and that I'd like to see more follow-up on. But then this one is the most illuminating, where they're talking about moral values of the country, moral values of the individual, and then moral values of the individual who is being elected. And seemingly again, looking at the breakdown here, where you've got conservatives and Republicans feeling that it's completely fine to elect someone who's done terrible things in their lives against the morals, even though they're the ones that claim that they want a more moral, wholesome, often citing Christian country. And it's a case of, well, you're obviously lying. And whilst this may not be representative because of the small size of the study and all the rest of it, if you even, you know, if you span this out and take into account other comments, then, you know, made by politicians, made by individuals who have been interviewed on these various topics, then it's a case of going, yeah, no, it makes sense. It's something we can see in larger demographics or in specific individuals over specific situations. And I feel like this is where parts of the problem are, where people aren't having the same conversation because you've got some individuals that are trying to stick with what they've said, what they've done, you know, what they want. But then you've got other individuals who are looking to kind of say one thing and do another. And I feel like that's part of the problem, because that disconnect in between people having one conversation and other people having another conversation, and there's not really a meeting in the middle, but they're expected to talk to each other. You know, that's where we were with Brexit before it happened. That's where we were with the primaries in the United States before they happened. Where we are with various other situations like North Korea, for instance. You know, it's all a bit of a breakdown, and I think this kind of level of hypocrisy highlights that situation as well, because you do have people who are directly contradicting themselves between what they've said 2 questions before and then what they've said now. So, you know, I've got the whole report here. I'll try and remember to stick the link in to the full report if you guys want to take a look at the whole thing. Or maybe I'll stick it up on Facebook for you guys to take a look at as a link as well. I don't know. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on these various things. As I've said, it's not super representative, considering it was done over 3 days with only 1,500 people. You know, I mean, the 3 days is fine considering you've only got the 1,500 people, but obviously more people would have been more representative. But hey ho. Either way, it seems like the numbers that they had in regards to the various demographics kind of add up, where you've got majority white with, about 10% being about 10%-ish being black and Hispanic and whatever else. So that's interesting. You've got a more aging population in their split, so it seems like they took some of these things into account when sampling, but to try and make it representative, but it's not it's still not got anywhere near the numbers to show that off on a wider scale. It's not, and granted, taking 10% of the US population would be difficult to try and make it more representative, but we've got this. We can look through it. We can see kind of what's going on, and it's interesting. I've seen lots of people complaining about the question about interracial marriage, saying, "Oh, however much of the population thinks that it's bad," and it's like, are you looking at this over here? Because that only relates to the split between gender, and that's the overall totals that you've got here from all the respondents. It's in fact, no, it's the totals for all of it, isn't it? No, sorry, got that wrong. But the totals for all of it, yeah, fine. It's showing off that it's 20% ish of the respondents here, 1/5. But at the same time, that's of an unrepresentative figure. So it's not something that, it's something we can look into. I would love more information on this. I'd love to know where these people came from. For instance, what part of the United States, how wide was the net cast, how many people came from red states or blue states and whatever else, what are the big issues where they are, has that informed the questions that they've answered in the way they've answered them. That's the kind of follow-up that I would like to see, because it then illuminates it, rather than these figures, whilst interesting, are still very vague, and they're only made worse by the fact that it's a very small sample. So when I've seen people complaining about this figure specifically, stop it. Quite frankly, because it makes, like, overall that 20% of people is 20% of, like, 1,500 people. At most that's about 500 people. It's not huge. So it's something to maybe take into account, but it's overall you're probably looking at 300 odd people for the most part, 500 if you take into account some of the other overlap, maybe. But overall, you're looking at about 300 people from this study saying that it's morally wrong. But at the same time, we don't know where these people are from. We don't know what their backgrounds are. We don't know why they're saying it. We can barely tell which race they're from. And the overarching thing is that, you're fine, regardless of age group, regardless of the majority in politics. This isn't an issue. Stop making a big deal out of it, because the more you make a big deal out of it, then it will become an issue. But anyway, there's more to go through in this, and I'd happily go through it because it's interesting. But I won't do unless you guys are interested. So if you'd like me to go through more of this, just because the US the information that they've gathered here, whilst not super representative, is still interesting. Does still seem to, at least in a way, reflect certain things that we see in international news from the United States anyway. So, I'd be interested to go through it, ask some more questions and stuff like that. But otherwise, guys, if you've got any other thoughts, I'd like to hear them. And otherwise, I will see you in the video later. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, then please drop us a like, share this video, and subscribe for more. And I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care.